Our next speaker is Brian McCaul. Brian has over 20 years' experience of working in technology and knowledge transfer. His positions have included Director of the Association for University Research and Industry Links, Director of Exploitation, a term I believe he appreciated, and Commercialisation at the University of Leeds, Director of the Institute of Knowledge Transfer. He's currently Director at Networth Net Limited. He's made a substantial contribution to the JISC Business and Community Engagement Programme. This is where I've had the pleasure of working with him. I'm really pleased that Brian is here today to talk about one of the most interesting initiatives to emerge from that programme. So, Brian McCaul.
Yeah, I usually drop the exploitation bit. People think I'm into human trafficking or something of that nature. Hopefully that'll stay on. Okay, so I'm talking about the Innovation Commons. Naturally, it's an online community, but it's a bit more. And I think one of the reasons I've been asked to talk about this is a sort of perception that it kind of works. There's a lot of those communities out there, but this one seems to have some traction, seems to add some value. It's, if you like, it's following on from what Daniel said. I don't quite walk around the world, get fuming at the lack of optimization of everything, but one thing that does annoy me is the lack of optimization within tech transfer. There's a lot of innovation going on, and we're not very good at getting it out there and making the most of it. So this is really where this started. It's more than an online community. It's not one of those sites where you throw your IP into the cloud and hope somebody stumbles across it and exploits it, which invariably doesn't work. There's a, if you like, there's a team of people, there's a crowd of people almost touching a little bit on the freelance economy that Daniel was talking about. So there's some crossover there, which I'll perhaps explore when we go through the slides. And the universities are sharing best practice tools, online tools, protocols, and a platform that walks them through that. Just to go back to that optimization side of things, I stumbled into this as a director of commercialization and exploitation for a large university, Leeds actually, sort of 8th largest research university in the UK. And I took on that role in about 2008. 2008 was a particularly problematic year in the year of technology transfer. Is that not working? Carry on. I'm not here. Okay. If you remember what was happening in 2008, basically the banks had crumbled. Things were getting very tricky.
Sorry. I'm not here.
Did you hear any of what went before?
Yes.
You did. Okay. Good. So it was a problematic time, 2008. The model that we had was very dependent on spin-out. So just to sort of rehearse what we did, technology transfer, creating companies from the innovations that come out of university research base, licensing ideas and innovations, intellectual property into corporates, collaborations, that sort of stuff. Leeds was very dependent on the spin-out model, very, very good at it, very effective. But it was very dependent on the venture capital community to do that. In 2008, that really wasn't happening. They were keeping their cash in their pockets. So I had to find a solution to that problem. What was I going to do for the next 3 years? So we thought very carefully about how we might optimize this process a little bit, using some of the notions of open innovation and other paradigms out there. And it forced me to think really about the problem of how difficult tech transfer is. It's not quite the travelling salesman problem, but there's lots of variables. Every time you start a new project, there's no steady state, it's a new innovation. It might have a different business model that applies to it, different inventor, so on and so forth. It's very complicated. You've got to get management into it, you've got to get money into it, you've got to protect the IP. So inherently a very difficult problem. But boiling it down to the three, what I call the bottlenecks that slow things down, these are what I regard as the key pinch points. The first is validation. Are these the right ideas to run with? Does this innovation have any legs? If you like to pinch a term from Clay Shirky, we've got a problem with filter failure. It's not that we have too much data in our lives, it's just we don't know how to filter it properly. The same in tech transfer. It's not that we have too many innovations, we just don't know how to validate them and filter them and work out how we prioritize which ones we take forward. It's an inherently difficult problem. And universities solve it in all sorts of ways that don't really help. They use committees, number one thing. A university always reaches for a committee if it's got something to decide on. It uses stage gate processes adopted from industry, which don't work because they're designed to work in a steady state process, and every time it's different for a tech transfer project. Or we employ lots of smart people to write business plans, and as soon as they see the light of day, they turn out to be irrelevant because reality changes everything. So that's the first bottleneck. The second bottleneck, which is not all the smart people, Nigel's already used that phrase, not all the smart people work for you. Now try telling that to a university and you're going to have a problem. But it's the reality. If you're running a tech transfer operation, some in our community, we have a community of about 10 universities using this in Anger, about 10 to join. They range from one-person tech transfer office who couldn't do this, just couldn't do any of this without adopting some of these techniques, through to organisations that have 20 or 30. It's still too limited a resource to be able to deal with every innovation that comes through your office. So we need to find ways of plugging those skill gaps and scaling up so that we're not limited. And the third obvious constraint is the funding gap. Universities aren't well resourced. This is getting worse. It's tied to the same problem with the VCs. They need to look at finding resource external to the organisation to make these things happen, particularly given that some of them have a lag of about 6-7 years. If you're talking about life sciences, to get something to market takes a lot of money. Most of them are going to fail. So those really are the problems. It's also working in an environment where that problem becomes more difficult. If you like, 5-10 years ago, it was acceptable to say we're resource constrained. We'll look for the big hitters and we'll ignore everything else. We'll find the IP opportunities, the innovations that have high growth potential, IP rich, we'll spin them out, we'll float them on the stock market. If you're a large university, you've got the capability of doing that, but we'll forget about student enterprise, lower growth, knowledge-based businesses and all those sorts of things. Well, the problem with that, one is it's too early to tell. So it just doesn't make sense to make that call too early in the process. You need a portfolio of activities. You're probably going to make more impact, social impact, economic impact, generate more income from the tail of activity, and the Amazons of this world have learned this in the long tail. And I think it applies all the more so in technology transfer. And I can certainly suggest that I've made more money as a tech transfer professional playing in the B area. But the third aspect is that we now live in the age of impact. Our governing funding bodies, HEFCE, etc., is looking for the impact that we have. And if we say, well, we can't, it's too complicated, we can't do any of this, we're going to focus on this. Or if you're a new university, we're only going to do this and we're not going to do any of that. It doesn't cut it anymore. You've got to be able to play across A, B, and C. So we've got to do more with less, is effectively where we need to be at. So that sounds a little bit like cake and eat it. Can you have your cake and eat it? Can we do more, have bigger impact with less resource? And I do think it is possible if we adopt some of the approaches that are being talked about from the open innovation canon. This goes to answering one of the questions. There are 3 approaches that we tend to use because they map onto the 3 problems, the 3 bottlenecks that I talked about. So these are the sort of collaborative paradigms, if you like, that go to the heart of what we do. The first is crowd wisdom. People may have read Andrew Surecki, and this notion that you can get better decisions than you can. I'd certainly say you get better decisions from the crowd than you will from a committee if you have the right diversity, the right expertise within it, and you organise it in the right way. There are ways of organising crowds that get dumb decisions, but if you do it in an effective manner, you can get much more sensible decisions. The type of crowd that we're dealing with is material to what we do. We're talking about entrepreneurs, investors, entrepreneur consultants, if you like, because what we're trying to do is take the half-invented ideas, the innovations that come out of the research base that need to be applied and need to find a way to market. So it's not ideation, we're not looking for more ideas, we're looking for a crowd wisdom that's going to help us convert those ideas into practical solutions in the marketplace. It very much touches on what Daniel was talking about here, is crowdsourcing. Again, not all the smart people work for you. There will be a general trend. I think that is one of the main thrusts of what universities need to wake up to. You will never be able, it doesn't matter how well resourced you are, how big you are as a university or a tech transfer office, you won't have all the skill sets within your organisation. So you need to find ways of reducing the transaction costs and finding the right people and dealing with the issues of trust, those sorts of issues that were mentioned earlier. And again, online systems and platforms can help in all sorts of different ways doing that. You can kind of do it offline, but it's not as easy. And then the third paradigm that we're throwing at this, which again maps onto that third bottleneck, is what I call crowd resourcing. Now, it's a deliberately more encompassing term than crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is definitely one of the things that we're talking about. It'll become a bit clearer why I've used a slightly more expansive term, because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are lots of financing routes other than just crowdfunding. So, bit of wisdom of the crowds, a bit of crowdsourcing, some crowdfunding. You'll notice in the first of those, crowd wisdom, we're also sort of stealing a little bit from the lean startup canon, which I think is really what universities need to get a heavy dose of as well, because I mean, this is just a quote from Eric Rice on the sort of inappropriateness of taking old management techniques and trying to apply them to startups. It just doesn't work. It slows you down. If you think you can business plan your way to working out what you should let out the stables or what you shouldn't, you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to slow yourself down. What we really need to do is invert the model. So the old model really was, we'll take a project, we'll take it from the research base. It looks like a good idea. We'll throw some resource at it, some proof of concept resource, we'll incubate it, and then we'll try and find a corporate or somebody who's prepared to take it on board. We'll find the market validation down the line. That's incredibly wasteful, really. And that's where the sort of lean startup really kind of adds to tech transfer. No, actually, try and get that validation very early. Even before perhaps you go into your business planning process, before you start throwing proof of concept money at it and turning it into a project. And those are the sorts of things that online communities like the Innovation Commons can help you do. We started doing this on an old network, the Global Innovation Network, which I set up about 8 years ago and was one of the first sort of communities discussing these sorts of issues in knowledge transfer. We amended it so that we could start polling and getting conversations, and I mean I couldn't even fit it on the screen. They get so sort of long, and we get so much feedback on these things. But essentially, what it does is it provides the universities with some ranking. If you've got 5 or 6 technologies or innovations, which 3 should you focus on? Which seem to have legs? If they've got legs, can you wheedle out from the community some really interesting snippets of leads where you should take it, reasons why it won't go, so the negative comments can be even more valuable. Can you elicit from them proposals from that community that they will take it forward and drive, play the role of that sort of proto-MD or deal maker that will drive it forward if you don't have the capacity internally? And we've done that time and time again with multiple universities, and they all get a good sort of hit from it. In a sense, some of the smaller universities use this as their primary way of doing tech transfer. So the 1 and the 2, 3 teams, some of them are actually, they don't do tech transfer in the old way at all. They throw everything through the Innovation Commons and see what works. Some of the bigger universities use it as an overflow capacity. Thrown this up because we are moving away from that old platform. This is, people might be aware of Connect and the catapults and the platform that lies behind that. The company that I'm involved in now provides those solutions to the Technology Strategy Board, so it's natural to start moving on to the platform that they use. It's an open source platform, and that reinforces part of the commons ethos. Nobody owns the network, nobody owns the software, nobody owns the people behind it. I feel like it's a very open and collaborative approach. But it also allows all sorts of integration possibilities. If we're building on the same code base as the Technology Strategy Board, which is one of the main funders of development in the UK at least, it allows us to sort of find all sorts of ways of sucking in information about what they might be prepared to fund. Big shout to JISC. JISC were the people that funded us to sort of pilot that, taking the old model, there's Caroline over there, and build in those 3 concepts of crowd wisdom, crowdsourcing, crowd resourcing into a bespoke platform. And they funded this first iteration of it, which was the universities, Liverpool John Moores, Liverpool University, working with the TSB and others, and the Science Technology Facilities Council came on board and used it as well. And we ran this on the back of a materials manufacturing campaign from the TSB, and that was the first time we'd run it on the new platform. We're in the process of rolling out institutional platforms. This is an example of a platform from Manchester University, so when they come on board, they'll be pumping lots of innovations through the commons, and that will really sort of be a bit of an inflection point in terms of activity. And then we're going to release in the next week or so the National Innovation Commons, which allows us to address these sorts of three issues, working with Durham and Northumbria University, backed by the IPO in this instance. That sort of freelancer economy is quite important behind that. This is a sort of visualization. It's a bit old now, but an early visualization of the skill sets that lie behind the entrepreneurs that engage with the university. So effectively, the deal is if they're helping the universities validate and filter and screen and produce business plans, multiple business plans in snips, they get the chance to pitch to run some of these projects. And they have to therefore have the right skill sets. And so we spend quite a bit of time managing that community and making sure they have the right understanding, technical understanding, they have the right connectivity to the marketplace, but importantly, they're prepared to share risk. And that's one of the things for the Commons, is that we want people who are able to take some skin in the game. And you can't do that. Part of the problem with employing everybody is not only you can't employ all the smart people, but you can't incentivize them often in the same way that you can with a freelancer economy. Some of these are organizations, but many are individuals. And many have led to some quite significant deals that the universities wouldn't have otherwise been able to undertake. So trust, how do we share the information about how they've performed, how do we encourage them to play the game in the right way, or all sort of, is all the sort of thinking that's going into the development of the new platform. So crowd resourcing, that's third problem. How do you get some cash and some resource into this process to make it work? Well, that valley of the death hasn't got any easier. It's got deeper and wider, if you like. The gap between the market and the research and the development is wider. We used to be very effective. In the early days of the Innovation Commons, we got very good at mopping up bits of regional development funding and those sorts of things. That's all disappeared now. It's harder to get grants from nationally, even the research councils, harder. That's made even worse, if you like, by the fact that the venture capital community have, in some senses, moved away from this very early stage innovation and backing that. Seen all sorts of quotes. Recently, the Entrepreneurs Manifesto this week suggested that it'd been halved across Europe, but certainly it's been getting harder to get venture capitalists involved in the early stage backing of businesses coming out of universities. So we've started looking elsewhere, and there is some silver lining. One of the silver linings is the angel community, the sort of small private investors. The trends are very clear that it's starting to take over much of that early stage investment space across Europe. Throw up some of the stats if we want on that. But in the UK, it's particularly interesting because we've got all sorts of nice tax breaks, EIS, SEIS, angel co-fund, etc., which make this a sort of an interesting space in which to play in. And so we've launched a sister project called Angel Accelerator, working with Liverpool John Moores University. Again, it was an intellectual property office backed project. See if we can pull that investor community into the Commons. But not standing still. We're always trying to push the edge and trying to find what's the next thing that would ease some of the bottlenecks. And crowdfunding is obviously one of those. The 23rd of September was not only Martin McFly Day, it was also the day that the Jobs Act was legal basically in the US to make equity crowdfunding legal. So this is a space that's going to explode. This isn't equity crowdfunding. This is a prepay. You buy it before they make it sort of model. But I like this slide just because the big figures. They went on here to develop the first smartwatch, tried to raise $100,000, ended up raising 10 million. And you could regard that as a bit of sort of, that's stateside, that's an outlier. But it comes a little bit more realistic for me because people like Piers here, who shares an office with me at Tech Hub in Manchester, looked to raise 11,000, ended up raising more than 400,000. I can kind of see how their business is taking off, and that's it's quite a powerful thing. I think probably for what we do, it won't be the prepay, although it might be part of the ecosystem. It'll be the equity-based crowdfunding model, the ability to invest, many people investing in businesses. And if there's one thing that's growing alongside the angel community, it's this crowdfunding community. So we've hooked up with Crowdcube, who've raised 12 million through their platform, effectively invented equity-based crowdfunding. Again, here's the trends in terms of growth. So I think this is an interesting space. It'll be an interesting space for student enterprise as well. But it's not that easily applied to university technology, and for a number of reasons. The first is university technology tends to be more complex.
if you're dealing with nanotechnology or the life sciences or monoclonal antibodies, if you try to play that across a crowd and say, look, do you want to invest a couple of hundred, few £1,000s in this, odds are they may not get it. So we need to think about that. It's much earlier, it's much riskier. The equity model, therefore, is appropriate, but we need to find ways of de-risking it to get public money in there, TSB money, to pre-filter it so the Commons helps us do that. And it also helps us inject some leadership. The thing about most of the technologies coming out of universities is that they don't have an entrepreneur who's got sole responsibility for getting that to market. You might have a tech transfer office, but it really needs one of these free agents, if you like, an entrepreneur, to drive it forward, even to drive it into a funding round for a venture capitalist or a funding round into a crowd campaign, or just to do the deal with a company that's interested in using it. On that, I do think the student enterprise thing is more suitable, and we may come back to that for more traditional and sort of existing models of crowdfunding. But this is a space, I think, where quite a lot's going to happen. If you like, what we're trying to do is find all the sweet spots between, well, okay, if the TSB is the place to be, that's the only large organisation that's funding innovation alongside the research councils in the UK. How do we overlay that with angel funding? How does that work? You're already seeing in the launch pads the requirement of some of the funding bodies, they need private match before you can even get public money. So that's an interesting space. The space between angel funding and crowdfunding, I think, is going to be an incredibly important space as well. So basically, that's what the platform is next looking at addressing. If you like, we're trying to find that line of sight between development grants up the proof of concept, TSB, angel funding pathway, so that things actually don't stall, so innovations don't stall, and then to layer on top of that crowdfunding at various parts of the process. So that's what we're trying to do. It's trying to use those three different collaborative approaches, a bit of crowd wisdom to overcome what's a fundamental problem in tech transfer. We just don't know what we've got. We can't sort the wheat from the chaff. A bit of crowdsourcing to get entrepreneurs, investors, but free agents and other intermediaries into this space to unlock what the universities aren't able to do, and to give it a healthy dose of funding so it doesn't run out of steam. And that's the Innovation Commons.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one quick question.